Coming up with Mikal Bridges as the centerpiece to the new core, how the Brooklyn Nets can improve their short and long-term future in the upcoming draft. We dive in next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, sir. It is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I'm, of course, Adam Armbrecht, breaking the New York Football Giants and the New Jersey Devils, and thanking you for making us your first listen. We're free on all those great platforms, and letting you know that today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. That's prizepicks.com, promo code Locked On and friends. We're going to get into what I think is now, as we're just right about exactly a month away from the NBA draft. We know that there have been already a constant stream of speculation, not just around the Brooklyn Nets, but around the NBA overall. What teams need to make big moves, how playoff success or failures have impacted the outlook for certain franchises. And there's a world where the NBA, which can get pretty chaotic in the offseason and around the draft, that this may be one of the more seismic shifting off seasons for some high profile teams, high profile players. But for the Brooklyn Nets, we had fun. And over the course of this episode, we're going to talk about what I identify as being the new core of the Brooklyn Nets. And on that premise, how do you build around that core through the upcoming draft? But we've talked about the possibilities of trades, Portland and Dame Lillard coming to Brooklyn, or Mikal Bridges leaving Brooklyn. But as we've seen in the last week or so from a lot of high-profile individuals, including John Hollinger from The Athletic, basically stating the Brooklyn Nets are not moving off of Mikal Bridges. And that matches what Doug and I have talked about over the course of this offseason. It's fun to speculate on if a deal came across your table, could you be inspired to make that move? But the likelihood that any team reaches that threshold of what it would take for the Nets to make a move like that is pretty slim, I think, at this point, at least as it currently stands. And in that vein, I started thinking about, as we've done, and you'll start to see this around the network as we get into June, we do our mock draft around the NBA draft and what could be expected. And while I can't get into all the details, short of saying you should keep your eyes open and ears open for that, it was informative around how many teams are looking to move up and down the draft board, which teams are valuing talent this year versus maybe next year, rookie prospects versus veteran supporting cast members. So it does give you a little bit of a roadmap around what the Nets maybe could accomplish. So the premise that I want to set up here is, when you look at the Brooklyn Nets and we think about who is the core going forward, we know it's Mikal Bridges. Lock it up. Let's not debate it anymore. With that being the case, we also then know that Cam Johnson, let's assume that the contract is getting signed and he's going to be here right alongside Mikal Bridges. Okay, check that box too. So now you have two of your new core. The last player, when I look at the roster, is Nicholas Claxton. Now, it's interesting that some people have started to throw him into trade discussions. If you could acquire player X, would you put Claxton in there? Would you accept pick number 10, number 15, number 4, if it was a package that include X, Y, and Z? But I just have to believe that the Brooklyn Nets, who have seen a 23, going to be 24-year-old, continue to take the next step in his growth and his development and what he can be as a player, it'd be really hard for me to think now that they've moved off of the superstar era, now that time is certainly more on their side, that they would all of a sudden say, this is when we'll move off of Claxton, knowing as well that we have an entire season and then an off season before we're talking about Nicholas Claxton and his upcoming contract. So there it is. Those three players to me represent the new nucleus. And this is not an ironclad, there's no more questions to be asked from me personally when it comes to Cam Thomas. Yeah, we know there's a million questions about how the organization feels about whether or not Cam Thomas can develop into X if they want him to be a part of it going forward. But let's leave that out of this discussion for right now because there's too many unknowns around it. We know that Ben Simmons has $40 million on the books here, and he's not going anywhere for 2 years. And yes, we can dream on him being healthy and being a contributor to this new core. But let's live in reality. Until he steps on the court, it doesn't matter. So we push these guys away, and we say the core that we have that we believe in over the next 1, 2, 3, 4 seasons, because we assume Claxton will get that next contract from Brooklyn, is Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, and Nicholas Claxton. And Spencer Dinwiddie is going to be here in the short term, but maybe there's a path forward where there's some movement around him. Veterans like Joe Harris, who just has $20 million and not a lot of athleticism left in the tank. Patty Mills, aging veteran who received an unpalatable contract looking back on it now from Sean Marks. And then a couple of veterans like Dorian Finney-Smith and Royce O'Neal that specifically, depending on when you look at the timeline, were brought in potentially to serve as supporting members to the Kevin Durant era and maybe don't have that same role anymore. And what we'll talk about coming up next here is specifically around the 4 players that I mentioned on the back end there. Dorian Finney-Smith, Royce O'Neal, Joe Harris, and Patty Mills. Because I believe that there's a path forward when we look at the draft and we think about the Nets being at 21 and 22 and having 2 options as far as improving this team, improving this roster. And I think that when you look at those players and look at where the salary cap is for Brooklyn and wanting to maybe help offset that Cam Johnson contract, wanting to shift a little bit younger and bring in some developing talent that you think can grow alongside of these players that in 2 years will be entering the pure prime of their careers, Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, Nicholas Claxton a little bit further away, that it becomes either one of, from each category, the valued veterans, Dorian Finney-Smith and Royce O'Neal, the non-valued veterans right now, the dead weight on the roster in Joe Harris and Patty Mills. Pick one from each category, try to push them together, and try to find a way to move off of them in the vein of improving your team. And when we look at the NBA draft and going through this mock with the network, you start to get a sense of where things lie. And a lot of people have seen it as you can look at 1, 2, and 3. Hey, those are clear cut. That's their own category. Then you go 4 through 8 or 9, maybe even to 10. That has a tier to it. The teens also has their own kind of area, the space that they're living in. But there were some informative things that came out of just these mock discussions that can tell us how the Nets need to approach this draft if they want to try to accomplish as much as possible on the books and on the court. And we'll get all of that coming up in just a minute, as well as a couple of names, by the way, prospects that I've liked as I've been going through the process, guys that are everywhere from inside of the top 10 all the way to maybe late surgers coming up the draft board who are outside of ESPN's top 25. But by the time we get to the draft next month, we could be talking about these players being inside of the top 15. So there's still a long way to go and a lot of movement that we're potentially going to see. Well, we can start to put the framework in place, and we'll dive in on that strategy of moving veterans and moving around the draft board in a moment. After, of course, we tell you about our friends, as we mentioned at the top of the show, Prize Picks. Oh, you know that we've talked about Prize Picks before. It is the easy way, as you know, to go ahead and get in on some daily action without having to worry about going up against all those sharks. You just pick 2 to 6 players and you choose whether or not they will score more or less than their Prize Picks projections, and you can win up to 25 times your money on a single entry. Again, no competing against other people, just you versus the projections available. Prize Picks offers projections on any sport that you can watch, includes the NBA, which is going on right now. Take Nikola Jokic, probably go over on rebounds. That feels easy to me, right? Go over on points for Jamal Murray, right? You can put these things together and have a heck of a lot of fun around the NBA playoffs. Also, the NFL, MLB, NHL, PGA, college football, men's college basketball, women's college basketball, soccer, WNBA, esports, NASCAR, tennis, MMA, boxing, disc golf, Euro basketball, cricket, and so much more. You go ahead and download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, they're going to give you $100. Deposit $50, they'll give you $50. You can do the math all the way down the line. Don't forget to enter promo code Locked On and sign up for an instant deposit match of up to $100. Excuse me as I clear my throat one time. Now, when we now turn our attention to how this team can improve going to the draft, there are two schools of thought around what the Brooklyn Nets may want to accomplish. And one thing that I was informed by this mock scenario is that there is some appetite from teams around the league around Dorian Finney-Smith and around Royce O'Neal. The question becomes, with 21 and 22, is it better for Sean Marks to say, well, what I'd like to see happen here is find one prospect that I like at 21 and then move 22 off, right? It's been speculated. Can I get an unprotected or a lottery protected pick in a future draft, which means I can get all the way up to 15 potentially, depending on which trade partner I find. And in doing so, you increase the likelihood that you find a talented player that you can add to the mix. And we know that the Nets also don't have control of their own first round picks still for another couple of seasons. So there's an element of that where I can get myself a more valuable piece that I have control of sooner if you push it back to, say, just next year's draft class. But the other way that you could look at this is Dorian Finney-Smith was said to have had 2 first-round pick value at the trade deadline. Does that value still exist is the first question that needs to be answered. And do the Brooklyn Nets, does Sean Marks think that if it's maybe waned down to just 1 first-round pick now, could it be 2 firsts by the time you get to the deadline in season? A very team-friendly contract, just $13 million on the books. But if you could package a Dorian Finney-Smith and throw in a Patty Mills contract and all of a sudden approach $20 million of cap relief while moving from where? From 21 up into the top 10 potentially, whether or not these are concrete speculations, I've at least had enough discussions with hosts around the Locked On Network to suggest that Dorian Finney-Smith in 21 gets you up the board substantially. And if it gets you up the board substantially, you can start thinking about potentially maybe a player, and some of these guys that I've been talking about mentioning prospects, in a guy like Anthony Black. Right now, he's currently listed on ESPN's big board out of Arkansas, 8th overall. There's going to be some movement there around it. But he's a guy that I think has length, right? Has a skill set on ball, still has to work on strength, still has to build up muscle, as a lot of young prospects do. But there's a clear talent there relative to where the Nets are going to be at 21 and a player that could come in and have an immediate impact. So you can shed $13 million, shift your pick up, and go get that guy. You can do the same thing with Royce O'Neal, by the way, but with his just north of $9 million, you start to speculate how much movement can we get done here. The other direction that the Nets could go, if we use kind of these two scenarios, and I said it before, pick any two, right? One from category A, Dorian Finney-Smith and Royce O'Neal. One from category B, Joe Harris and Patty Mills. The guys in category B don't get you anything back. It costs you something to unload them. But another way that the Nets could do this is make a marginal move back in the draft. You could go ahead and say, I have pick number 22, and I'm looking to unload Patty Mills and that $6.8 million over the next 2 seasons. Or I have 1 year left with Joe Harris, but I have the Cam Johnson contract coming in, and I really want to have that $20 million clean and clear so that I don't get myself into any deeper of potential holes here, knowing that I can't do anything with Ben Simmons' money right now. If you go from 22 to the back end of the first round, if you go from 22 all the way out of the first round into next year's draft, you may be able to unload 20 million. You may be able to stay in the first round and unload 6.8 million in Patty Mills and still be able to go out and get yourself a prospect. And I think the question now becomes, how far is Sean Marks willing to go in this new core era? Because we're mentioning these guys, Dorian Finney-Smith, Royce O'Neal, and then problems on the roster like a Joe Harris, like a Patty Mills. But if you go back in and you look at this roster in totality, yes, is there another viable player in Spencer Dinwiddie that certainly could be discussed in trades? 100%. The problem is, and people may not love to hear this, that I don't think that Spencer Dinwiddie is necessarily going anywhere. I think that he might also be representative of that restabilization that the organization wanted to have in the post Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving era. Now, knowing that he's coming into the final year of his contract and he's making $20 million, you could say it's not worth carrying that and that he's not going to be the long-term point guard. And I agree with that. I don't necessarily, look at him and say you can't bring him back on another deal. It can't be for 25 million, right? He can't be making close to what Cam Johnson's going to make if you believe in the hierarchy of expectations on Cam Johnson pairing with Mikal Bridges. But if you find the right price point on a 3-year deal and you go in and you find ways to add more talent at the point guard position, yeah, Spencer Dinwiddie can still have a role here. So I stopped just short of adding him into the mix of players that could be discussed simply because the balancing act that needs to be struck here is getting younger, bringing in new talent, feeling like over the next couple of seasons, you're still going to be competitive and making the playoffs, getting through the play-in tournament, etc. And you have to have some veterans there to do that, right? You have to improve this roster in certain ways in order to accomplish it. And that's why I think it becomes, if you move Dorian Finney-Smith, then you probably keep Royce O'Neal. If you move Royce O'Neal, then maybe you keep Dorian Finney-Smith. The Joe Harris, the Patty Mills of it all, those are things you want to move on from. But we already know Seth Curry is going to be gone from here. We don't know what to expect, as we mentioned at the top, around a Cam Thomas going forward. Edmund Sumner is still under contract. What does he look like? The players that didn't get any run when it came to playoff basketball, Yuta Watanabe, by the way, right? Like there's all these kind of names just floating around that we got excited about and liked, but do they matter as much now going forward potentially as unrestricted free agents, restricted free agents, final year of contracts, big money on the books? What do they look like now for this team? So I think the Nets will try to pull the trigger on at least one of those two trade packages. And I think the more likely of the two is something that we can discuss coming up here in a second. What is more likely for the Nets to accomplish, and what do I think they should accomplish? And it'll also include highlighting another couple of players here when we think about the NBA draft and where this team can go in terms of talent. Because I mentioned there at the top, in building this new core around Mikal Bridges and in looking at the draft, there are a couple of players here that if the Nets were to stand pat at 21 and 22, and maybe trade one of those, but if they're going to be picking in that area there, they may have to do a little bit of work in order to secure a player that I think really fits what they want to do or has the upside that they want to lean into. So we'll mention another couple of names here in addition to Anthony Black that I really liked. We'll use some of those mock scenarios from the network just to kind of inform it. It's not how it played out on draft night, but it does tell us that certain talents are rising in the eyes of NBA teams. And the Nets are going to have to do some work if they want to make a big move here. Let's dive in on the most likely of outcomes here and what I think they should do. So you have Royce O'Neal, you have Dorian Finney-Smith. Their combined contracts get you north of $22 million. You have Joe Harris and Patty Mills. Their combined contracts get you north of 26, almost $27 million. In these different combinations, they can clear anywhere from $13 to $33 million off their books. Sorry, 17 to 33 million off their books, because the lowest level one is, say, like a Royce O'Neal, Patty Mills combination. And these can involve multiple teams, by the way. It doesn't need to be that Team X takes on both of their contracts. You get a third team involved. You have a second round pick get thrown into the mix for a Royce O'Neal deal that goes ahead and passes along as some compensation for picking up the money of Patty Mills, right? There's ways to facilitate those trades. And there was plenty of discussion around this on the network. And more specifically, I'll say with Royce O'Neal, because he fits more teams' molds. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago with the Golden State Warriors, right? Doug Norrie very accurately brought up, and it actually has come to fruition. So, Pat, if you hear or see Doug on the internet, give him a virtual pat on the back, because he was kind of on the front foot of the Kuminga possibility and potential, and that certainly has picked up more steam. And now, when we've had some conversations with the Locked On Warriors, they've said, yeah, if we were looking at it, Dorian Finney-Smith doesn't fit the mold, but Royce O'Neal could, right? And if we want to go down that road, then it becomes about what picks and compensation, etc. Another way, too, just when we think about the Nets improving themselves, is looking at the possibility of adding veteran talent from around the league. The biggest problem there to me, and I'll use Golden State as the example because we've heard a lot about Jordan Poole. Could Jordan Poole be an option? And we want it, and we can go inside the Brooklyn Nets and say the Nets do take and Spencer Dinwiddie and put him on the table because the money works. Yeah, but I don't know if Jordan Poole making $34 million 3-4 years from now is necessarily the commitment that the Brooklyn Nets want to make in this moment, right? So there's no point in shedding money if you're just going to keep piling it back on. The Nets' goal here is to bring down the cap number, get younger, get talent in, and still feel like you can stay competitive in the Eastern Conference for the playoffs. Like, that is the overall goal here. And you can see how, in discussing with other hosts, where the pushback is going to come, right? Hey, that's a young player. We're not ready to give up on them yet. We want to hold on to them. We want to shed off a contract that we think is a little bit bloated here. That still has certainly value, but we want to move the numbers around, knowing that we have other deals that we're going to have to manipulate and restructure as we move forward. So there are those possibilities. But if on the Brooklyn Nets, I mentioned Anthony Black, I'm going to mention a guy like potentially Jordan Hawkins out of UConn, which wasn't like I'm not going to put him among my favorites. Taylor Hendricks, though, out of UCF, I liked his game a lot, and he's sitting there currently 9th overall. And then as you work your way down the board, the name in Ryan Rupert that nobody wants to hear me or the Brooklyn Nets say because he's out of France and there's an affinity there potentially with Sean Marks, and he's long, but he's very developmental, and we don't want to have to take a pick that ends up being a guy we don't see for a few years, if ever. There's also guys like Derek Lively II, who is currently 25th on the big board, certainly has the body for the NBA, the live wire body, but is going to have to work and develop key areas of his game, maybe somewhat familiar to what Nicholas Claxton has gone through over the start of his career. What does that look like as well? But the one thing that I noticed in this mock, too, was how in the range that the Nets pick in, so Noah Clowney out of Alabama, we heard a little bit about him. I took a look at Leonard Miller and liked him there at 22 currently. Chris Murray out of Iowa. These are guys that are currently labeled as 19, 22, 24. They all went, a little bit earlier in some mocks, a little bit later in others, but there's a shifting of the board here. And this is even beyond the network discussion that you'll see come out next month. Some of these guys go higher or lower. You have Bryce Sensabaugh. You have, what was it? Yeah, also, sorry, excuse me, I'm losing track here. Derek Lively II was a guy like 25th. Where do you think he ends up going? And then as you stretch even further down in the back end of the first round, Derek Whitehead, another guy to think about. Colby Jones out of Xavier, another name to keep an eye on. Andre Jackson out of UConn. All the way down, though, to a guy like Gregory Jackson II, who I really like. And as I've looked through the prospects, think, hey, like, he's a guy that could fit the Brooklyn Nets mold. He was a late submission into the draft this year. This is a player that you could dream on developing at 6'9", 215, being a bit of a versatile weapon, having value on both ends of the floor. But by the time we get to next month, these names are going to shift and move around so much that if the Brooklyn Nets are committed to getting younger and getting a player out of this draft, I think they're going to have to move either marginally up into the teens or potentially substantially up towards 10 if they really like a name up there. And that's why Royce O'Neal and Patty Mills shed those contracts, move from 21 up to 15, trade out with 22, and call it a day. Add one young player, keep a veteran here, add him into the fold with Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, Nick Claxton, Spencer Dinwiddie still there, and sort out some of the other players that you're going to need to have here. Flip it the other way, shed Dorian Finney-Smith, gosh, you'd love to say you shed Dorian Finney-Smith and Joe Harris and clear $33 million off the books and go find a player that makes sense. No matter what the Nets do, though, I'll close out on this idea that these players that I'm talking about, first of all, we know one thing. It's going to take time for them to develop. So when I say the new core for Brooklyn is centered around Mikal Bridges, you have to strike the balance of not wasting a year, right? And not wasting a year for Brooklyn means just not missing the playoffs right now. So any move that you make has to be couched in the idea getting rid of Royce O'Neal does make you a lesser basketball team, marginally, depending on who you bring in. But it does change expectations slightly just because he's a quality veteran in the NBA. Just like with Dorian Finney-Smith, just like with a Spencer Dinwiddie if you put him into a trade, just like a Cam Thomas if you threw him into the mix on something. He's at least a microwave scorer that could steal you a few games throughout the course of a season. So those moments are going to have impact. It just matters to say, if we sacrifice the first 25, 30 games of our season in developing some younger players, what's the payoff on the back end potentially? And that's what gets me excited. Because in my mind, that's what I think the Nets should do. I would make packages around both of these picks. I would move off the veterans, and I would bring in the right young talent that you can just squint and see this team getting back to and beyond the place they were in these last playoffs. And that doesn't mean that they're going to go to a fifth seed, a fourth. I'm not putting those things on the table. I just mean a team that when you go back and look at their record, you'll say, yeah, they're going to be able to sustain 500 plus basketball throughout the course of an NBA season, knowing that they were a just under 500 basketball team after the superstar trades went down. So there is a path forward here for the Brooklyn Nets. I am very curious to see if fans get excited or deflated by that prospect. Because when you talk about building the new core around Mikal, in theory, standing totally pat here, which would be disappointing for multiple reasons, but you could understand why with a 27, 28-year-old leader of your team, you don't want to necessarily jump ship on the 30-year-old veterans that can support him. I just think that the Nets need to strike that right chord of getting younger, of shedding money, and of looking at the next 4 years as incremental growth year over year, so that by the time we're at the spot where Mikal Bridges and Cam Johnson are in the final year of their contracts and they're 31, going to be 32 years old, that we're maybe peaking on whatever this team could be. And hopefully something that Sean Marks has done an excellent job of, if you are targeting quality prospects, hopefully one of those guys spikes. And all of a sudden you go and relook at the hierarchy of your team and say, it's Mikal Bridges, it's new player X over these next couple of seasons, it's Cam Johnson, it's Nicholas Claxton, et cetera, down the line. And then we also know that we have that next wave of picks coming in at the back end of 27, 28, 29, where you continue to replenish it. This is about sustainability for the Brooklyn Nets. And I think that executing the draft efficiently, identifying 3-4 prospects that you really believe can have an immediate impact, and doing what's necessary to go get them. In all likelihood, I think the Nets end up staying around 20 and 21, trying to shed one contract, maybe two, and then picking one of those two picks. Because it is an ultra competitive league on draft night when a pick goes up as being available. And that's going to be the hardest thing for the Brooklyn Nets, because the one thing the Nets don't want to have to do is give up future assets. They don't want to give up a pick to attach to Joe Harris to get off that contract, right? They don't want to have to give up a pick to move up the board with another player off the roster to go get X. Other teams are going to be willing to do that. Teams that feel like they just missed the playoffs but are ready to surge. Teams that came up short, like the Chicago Bulls, depending on what they choose to do this offseason. So there's going to be some very hungry, desperate teams out there. And I don't think that Sean Marks and the Nets look at it as being a desperate time for them. They look at it as being a patient time for them, and hopefully a smart time where they continue to build up this roster. Friends, it is a Monday morning. I thank you. I'll stick around actually for a few minutes here if you're in the chat because I ended up running this one live. So I'll hang out and we'll chop it up here for a second to get your sense of this. I think people are still very much divided a little bit just about Mikal Bridges and not only whether that should keep him, but whether or not he is the player that some people think he is and will continue to grow into. Get us over on YouTube in the meantime. Get us on the podcast feed. And as always, with no Doug Norrie, there is no quote short of saying that I miss my friend. And I can't wait until he's back here so we can keep talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball. All right, a little post podcast, little unique opportunity here. Let's see what the people have. I'm only gonna stay for a couple of minutes here. And just check in with everybody. I saw some things when we were getting geared up around a comment that it said something about like Bridges not necessarily being that guy. Um, so and that he faded in the playoffs was one of the comments I saw, which I didn't really understand. Yes, he got tired in the playoffs, as the entire team collectively did. But he had really big performances there in that Philadelphia series that I think was the confirmation that he could be that good, including Cam Johnson being able to take that next step as well. Saw this one from Al Mack. Are Cam Johnson and Bridges a package that can't be separated? Yeah, that's the good question, right? Because um you could make a case that maybe Cam Johnson on a sign and trade significantly moves the needle for this team in terms of what they could develop. Um and then it's weird because then it goes up the chain of command. Are they a package you can't separate? Well, is Mikal Bridges a player that you don't want to rock the boat on in terms of him being comfortable and feeling good and being excited about being in Brooklyn and being the new superstar, right? Great interviews with him over the past week where he talked about all of a sudden, I'm that guy. I'm the superstar and I'm getting treated that way by people around the team, by, people in his locker room. And he said like he wants to keep that same even keeled. I'm here to show up and work and play basketball and do my thing and help this team win games. So, does that extend to the idea of Cam Johnson isn't the perfect fit for us and we want to go in a different direction and Mikal is still excited and happy to be here? I don't think that Mikal would ever verbalize or vocalize, you know, demand that Cam Johnson stay. I also think that the Nets, I think they believe in him. And I personally think that he has the perimeter shooting touch, obviously. He has a little bit of the off the ball dribble. We saw some real explosive plays in that playoff series against Philly, attacking at the basket. I think it's just about getting him that last little extra step up in his game, and I actually be happy to say that it's a package you can't separate. Um, and this one here, by the way, and this could be referring to a lot of broad stroke stuff, but like 21 and 22 in terms of draft picks, like they're not, it's a crapshoot when it comes to the draft. If you're not picking in the top 5, if you're not picking the top 10, et cetera, right? And that's where I think, again, how these things work. I mentioned there at the top of that, in the first segment of that show, of saying, well, Royce, so say it's Patty Mills and 22, and you're going to drop out of the first round. That's worth it because you're clearing money off the books. It's not a huge chunk of money, but again, especially if you're re-signing Cam Johnson, you're going to count every single dollar, knowing that you want to recalibrate that and keep looking towards the end of Ben Simmons' contract, where then real money opens up. And by the way, you also know you need that real money to open up because you're going to re-sign Nick Claxton here along the way too, right? So between Mikal, Cam, and Claxton, 2 years from now, you'll be looking at their money and saying they're all making somewhere $22 to $26 million on the books. So you're going to have 60, $70 million in between those 3 players potentially. Let's see what else we got down low here. Sure. Get it out. Let it out. It's a frustrating thing. I watched something interesting over the weekend that I'll maybe bring up this week with Doug that I just thought was eerily informative about the future. It's something from years ago, going back 7, 8 years ago, that really made it interesting. Made it interesting to watch where his career has gone. Jokic was a second round pick and he's the best player in the league. Yeah, I mean, listen, they're where people get picked, and the the potential of getting a guy like that. I mean, listen, Nick Claxton, who's not Jokic, calm down, But they classed him with a second-round pick that's clearly outperformed his draft stock, right? So you can spike on those things, but um, you need to take as many shots in the range where you think the potential is that much higher as possible in order to get better. I saw a good one from what else we got here? There was an FYI here. Oh, it came back in here. Didn't have a winning record, and Cam Thomas has a better record. I'm assuming you're saying when he started and never got the chance again. Yeah, again, we went over like what Cam Thomas's record was when he scores X amount of points. It was all relative. You can make a case on either side of it about who he was playing with and where that value was. Likewise for Mikal Bridges, you're never going to question his individual performance versus what the team's record is, obviously. But that there's just something more there than just Cam Thomas can score buckets, but he can't get on the court. There's something organizationally happening there with the individual that we just have to wait and see. Yeah, this was a good one. We've heard about this. Doug is going to be connecting with Jackson Gatlin from Locked On Rockets to have this discussion. This is not off the table. There's a couple of different scenarios. We've done it with Locked On Portland with the Blazers as well. There's a couple of different like facets to it. I think that it is incredibly enticing, but I don't know. Again, it's a viable option, except for the fact that the Nets made these trades in a way and discussed after the trades in a way and look to be moving forward in a way that says that they're going with this current core right now. They're not going to go the route of the full-on rebuild, right? They're not going to send Mikal Bridges to Portland for Sharp and the third overall pick. Like, those things aren't going to happen, so it makes it hard to look at one of these deals and say, oh, that's going to be a viable option. And again, getting back obviously future pick next season to have control of it. And again, like while having control of your own pick does matter, obviously, again, then you have to strip this thing down to the nuts and bolts. And this is where you look at a team like the Thunder, who Doug pointed out a couple weeks ago. You know, it was 2 seasons. They were in the playoffs, 2 really bad years, and then back in it, right? So the turnaround doesn't have to be that long. So I'm not saying that I philosophically disagree with like just doing the full rebuild, but it doesn't look like that is what the Brooklyn Nets are going to do, what they want to do, and how they want to approach this. That being the case, enjoy your Monday, everybody. I just wanted to kick it for a couple extra minutes here. Hopefully, everybody is excited, man. It's a month away, almost, I think, exactly to the day. It's a month away, and we'll see where it goes from here for the Brooklyn Nets. Mention you guys on all the social media at Adam Armbrecht, at Doug Norrie, at Locked On Nets. Have some fun out there. Chop it up. Send some of your prospect ideas. Give me a prospect on YouTube or on social media over on Twitter that you think the Nets could draft in the first round, where they need to move marginally up. Let's, cap it. Let's not get crazy up to pick number 5. But give me a prospect that you think the Brooklyn Nets could draft and have him come in and immediately help elevate where this team is in the upcoming season. Because that's some of the stuff we want to talk about going forward here. And I think it'll be a lot of fun to do. In the meantime, though, get us everywhere, support us everywhere. We appreciate you supporting us everywhere. And we'll talk to you next time here on Locked On Nets Basketball.